My friend Grace has one of the coolest jobs and job titles in experimentation. She's the head of experimentation and failure at FLIGHTSTORY, a media production company that you might know for their flagship podcast, Diary of a CEO, which has almost 15 million subscribers on YouTube and regularly garners millions of views on episodes that are often over 2 hours long.
The fear of failure is one of those things that we all have. Diary of a CEO has a head of a failure. She's actually Australian, by the way, Grace Miller.
Everybody always wants to know, what does it mean to be the head of experimentation at a podcast production company? And experimentation is an incredibly important function there. In fact, CEO and Diary of a CEO host Stephen Bartlett recently shouted Grace out on national news.
A winning strategy for a changing world, a rapidly changing world, if the futurists are correct, is to increase your rate of experimentation and failure. So in my company, we actually have someone called Grace Miller who's our head of failure.
So I asked Grace to come on Outperform to break down her job and talk about the types of experiments she runs that are familiar to other companies, the work she does that is very different and unique to working at a media brand, and what she's learned along the way and stories that she can share from years of helping build the experimentation function at FLIGHTSTORY. I'm Ryan Lucht, and this is all on today's episode of Outperform. All right, Grace. Well, thank you for joining us. I'm super excited to have you chat because I think a lot of people have seen your name and your title and where you work on LinkedIn, and they're like, why does the Diary of a CEO podcast and the FLIGHTSTORY, production company have a head of experimentation and failure? It's a great job title, the first part. I think most people stop at head of experimentation. But then it's also kind of an interesting use case or industry. It's not where we typically see peers in experimentation. So I think everyone's very excited to learn more about what you actually do day to day.
Yeah, I think it feels very non-traditional in the experimentation world, where most people are in CRO sort of experimentation. And so we only started this team just over 2 years ago, based on the likes of seeing Amazon, Google have experimentation or innovation departments. And we thought, why don't we do that if we want to be the best in the world in this area, in the media industry? And so Steve said, I want to have an experimentation team. Would you want to do that? You're already doing it within the role. I was in the social media and marketing team within the company. And I said, okay, I'll give it a go. Like, why not try and see what happens? I didn't really know what experimentation was at the time. I knew we were trying new things, but I didn't know it was called experimentation. And so I took a leap and thought, okay, I'll give it a go. And now it is an entire team in the company that works for in FLIGHTSTORY now, which is across all of our news shows. So we have 5 podcasts and we get to help them experiment. So there's kind of different routes within the business where we experiment. And it's not just on the podcast or the media side. It's also in our product, which is, I'd say, more traditional through CRO. It's also with our marketing team through email and through paid media and things. And then there's even further routes where it could be our brand partners, and we understand how can we experiment to help them get better performance from their ads. So it's kind of across the whole business now of finding ways to experiment and grow. And yes, some are less traditional than what you could test on a website with statistical significance. But I think it's a whole ethos of a company and team trying new things and finding ways to grow what they're doing.
Yeah. And I love that so much because I think in some of the more traditional experimentation roles, sometimes you lose sight of what makes experimentation so great, which is just that spirit of tinkering and trying things out and learning. And you can fall into focusing a little too much on the technical things and the statistics side of things, which I love to nerd out about, but is not why I fell in love with experimentation in the first place. So yeah, your role obviously runs quite a wide gamut. Why don't we start with maybe the parts of it that would feel more familiar to someone who's in an experimentation role at an Amazon or, at a smaller e-commerce company or, a tech product?
Definitely. I think probably The most traditional parts of that are our product and website, where we are constantly experimenting, our paid media marketing, and then also probably the things like email. And so on our product site, we have only been experimenting for about a year on that, which is still really fresh, and we're learning things every day of how to improve. And we make mistakes as well. Like, there's failures all the time. But I think the best part is trying new things. Like, we wouldn't be able to improve our conversion rate if we hadn't tried. Like, we could just go, okay, we're just going to keep the website, see how it goes. But actually being able to experiment and implement experimentation tools onto the site so that we can better judge the different areas of the site, whether it's something like adding a add to cart button on a menu page that seems really simple, but some sites don't have it. Or things that are even more detailed, like how do you understand the performance of adding like UGC or reviews on the product page to help convert. And probably the most exciting one that we've been experimenting with is like the in-cart and post-purchase behaviors and how we can build on that. So there's been a lot in the product world, and that's probably the most traditional. And then in paid media for all different areas of the business, we've been experimenting, which is obviously a great platform because you can really tell the difference between A/B testing and multivariate testing on there. And so that's whether it's product and understanding how different ads perform, or the podcast in general. And we test things from trailer hooks to thumbnails, and trying to understand almost the pre-predicting side of it. And I get prediction isn't always accurate. I'm reading a really good book right now on I think it's called like The Art of Science and Prediction, and about how inaccurate predicting is. But the more we can at least try and have some data to base our decisions off, especially when it's something that traditionally might not have been able to be an experiment in the sense of traditional experimentation, we will try. So we're trying to do anything we can to get data before we release anything, whether it's the podcast, trailers, Steve's book, like we will try and get as much data as possible. Even events, like where are the people that want to come to events and why? So it's kind of a mix between consumer research and experimentation for things like that. And then obviously the other side is 100 CEOs, which is our email newsletter. And we also have other email newsletters now coming out for the other shows. So how can we experiment on those? Is it something traditional like a subject line? And how do you understand open rates? Or what are you putting in the email? And we've done like experiments of no design versus design, or where do you put the button? Is it above the fold, below the fold? So it's like really simple things, but they matter so much, and it should be more of a normal thing that businesses should be implementing. Like obviously those are very traditional experimentation, but I think even some businesses aren't at that stage yet to know how or when to do it.
Yeah. So those website experiments, I think everyone listening is like, okay, I know exactly what those are, and clearly Grace knows her stuff. Like we can, put aside any skepticism that she doesn't know what we're talking about.
I hope so, but I'm still learning.
I want to briefly dive into some of the things you mentioned around running experiments, like within the media itself, because I think for those of us who work outside of podcasting and media, we're like, okay, yeah, like YouTube thumbnails. We all know at this point that YouTube creators like test a bunch of thumbnails and they see what gets clicked on. But I would imagine it's a far more intricate world than that, where you mentioned like hooks and trailers for the shows. Like there's especially at the scale of a show like the ones you work on, like little differences in how well you capture people's attention can make a huge difference. Can you talk about some of the other types of tests you run on episodes or other like media formats themselves?
Yeah, I think the whole world, whether you're in podcasting, whether you're in media, especially on YouTube, the experimentation is endless, and it really changes depending on what sort of content you're creating. So when I was at 1 Billion Followers Summit recently, and it was basically a summit with a lot of creators and YouTubers, and every single one of them is experimenting, whether they call it experimenting or not, but they do call it testing, and they're testing things within their videos. But it changes depending on kind of the platform or the like style. So for example, Mr. Beast, he's obviously, and there's I know he's massive, but there's lots of creators like him, Ryan Trahan. There's so many different people within that kind of gamified world of challenges. But the way they edit and the things they're experimenting on, like retention and fast edits and keeping things on screen to keep attention, is very different to how you'd edit a long form podcast where it's a maybe 20-minute, 30-minute video for Mr. Beast versus a 2 to 3 hour podcast. And how do you keep people interested for the whole thing? And it comes down to experimenting in the right format depending on what you're doing. And we even have it across our slate now. So we obviously have the Diary of a CEO, which is the long form 2, sometimes 3 hour podcasts. We have our Clips channel, which is shorter versions of the podcast, usually 20 minutes. Then we have Behind the Diary, which is kind of a vlog of Steve's learnings or Steve's life. And then we have other things coming out soon. And hopefully, maybe when this comes out, some of them will have launched. But one of them is like an animated YouTube channel. And it's really interesting how across all 4 of just those formats within the Diary of a CEO has completely different experimentation. Some are the same, like the thumbnails has a similar format of how, not the design, but a similar format of how you would test them. But then things like retention, of how we would hold retention on an animated show versus the long form, is very different. And it's, for the long form, it's how do we keep them engaged or watching, but not make it choppy where you go, oh, this is jarring. And even things like, how often do you put an ad in? So that not only the podcast is benefiting, but where is the line of where people get annoyed when there's too many ads? And Diary of a CEO has been amazing for having very little ads for the last 4 years. It's been so much about the user journey and the experience. Whereas other shows will just throw the ads in because they obviously are seeking a different reward, but it's finding a balance and experimenting with like, where do we place the ads? How many do you place? All the way to like call to actions when you ask people to subscribe. What is the best way to ask people? When do you ask? Is it at the start when people have just joined? Or is that too soon because they're not fully engaged? Is it at the end before they fall off, but then you have less people listening? So it's kind of so many nuances to, depending on what sort of content you create, the length, and also your audience and how they're currently interacting, and how do you kind of experiment to understand them better and new audiences better.
Yeah. Do you find that trends shift often? Like, do you find yourself going back and retesting the same things with any degree of frequency?
Yeah, all the time. Like I'd say the 2 most obvious ones are thumbnails, which everyone can see as testing on YouTube. So you can go on and look at the evolution. Like if you put oldest videos on Diary of a CEO, you'd see what they looked like 5 years ago. To now, one of the most monumental changes we made was previously, I think maybe 3 years ago, we made this change. The thumbnail was only the guest's face. It didn't have Steve's face. And we thought, why don't we just try it? Like, let's see what happens. Let's put Steve's face on there and kind of experiment with, like, does he have an influence? And it did. It performed better every single time. And I think the most important learning from that was like, okay, we thought that the other design of just a guest face and text was better. But actually the biggest learning is we need to experiment constantly on what is still performing. And so the thumbnails alone have been from no face of Steve to his face. Then we've tested like hands. So should he be pointing? Should there be no hands? Should a mic be in the shot or no mic? And then now you'll be able to see there's a lot of experimentation happening with the designs. So is there images in it that are more appealing? Do we change the color, which we've tested a lot of? Because obviously lots of people now copy the thumbnails. So could it be too similar to what's already on YouTube? But I think the coolest part is like Steve is so involved in this. He is obsessed with finding out what works and what doesn't. Like a lot of the thumbnails you'll see, some of the design ones are Steve himself trying it out. And I think that's the best part, is whoever is the host or leading a company needs to be really experimentation minded as well and encourage trying new things. And if something doesn't work, okay, that didn't work, let's move on to the next thing. That it really needs to come from people encouraging it.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, that trend is true from like the tech companies who have the biggest experimentation programs in the world too. Like CEO support and engagement is, I mean, obviously very important, but when a CEO really engages with the experimentation program, it's almost impossible to beat, right? Like Jeff Bezos talked about experimentation in so many of his Amazon shareholder letters, or Reed Hastings at Netflix recorded the A/B Testing 101 video course that all new hires are required to take. And
like Netflix has a whole, obviously I'm sure they don't share everything, but they have a whole site on experimentation where you can see more insight, which is really cool because it gives other people in the world like ideas and inspiration to do those things, which I love. And I think it's where you can sharing more about experimentation, especially from people like that, is so inspiring. I agree.
It's a huge recruiting tool too. Like that's why Netflix does it, is because they get to say, like, here are the cool problems you could work on if you come join us at Netflix. And of course, really smart people, they want to, work in companies and cultures where they're free to try their ideas out and see what actually happens, as opposed to, if I have an idea, I need to go through 7 levels of approvals and bureaucracy before, anyone's going to see this tested in the real world. So it's a huge unlock.
Yeah.
So that's your world of, online A/B tests, or things that look a lot like A/B tests. But I know that Flight Story, you do a lot of very big experiments that are offline or not A/B tests, and you take the word experiment very broadly and I think a quite inspiring way. Can you tell us about any of these sort of like big swing crazy things you've tried recently?
Gosh, yeah, there's been so many, whether it's when we hit, this was a long time ago because we're at 14 million subscribers on YouTube now, but when we hit 1 million, which was a massive achievement for us, we had like a DOAC rave, and Steve was really into DJing at the time. So we just held an event in London. We invited everyone down, had a party, invited heaps of DJs as well, and they all played sets, and then Steve played, and it was just to see, does it work? And it's been like, I think the live events one is really cool because it's expanded so much. Like Steve has a show called Diary of a CEO Live, which is the previous ones I've run have been like a spoken word and musical performance. So there's like a choir, and Steve also speaks, and then there's pieces from the podcast as well. And originally that started in Manchester. There was a show, and then we brought it to London, tested it out some more times in London. It sold out so quickly. And then we thought, okay, why don't we take it around the rest of the world? So 2 years ago, we went to Australia and New Zealand to do it. And then last year, they went to Asia to take the tour around. And so it was Diary of a CEO Live, sharing the learnings from Steve's life and the podcast. And it's one of the most inspiring shows that I've ever been to, not just because I work here, but someone who used to work in the company, this was when the first one was 4 years ago, he watched it and then he said, I need to go and chase my dreams. That has been so inspiring. And so he was like, I'm going to leave. I think it was hilarious because the show was too inspiring that it encouraged someone from our team to leave. But it was so nice that it inspired so many people around the world. And I think we do a lot of experimenting online, and our whole company is online in terms of media. That how do we also do the experimenting in person and give people the opportunity to connect? Because I think it's not just in our company, but around the world right now, human connection and community is a massive thing people are looking for, when online can be a very fun but also toxic environment of not actual real connection. And so I think it's so important to have media online, but then also bring those people together offline. And so we've not only had those shows, but we also had a conversation cards dinner, which is we made a physical product off questions in the podcast. So Steve gets the guest to write a question in the book at the end of the show. And we made those into cards. There's 3 versions of them now. And when we release them, we would host dinners. So we would invite our community down, and everyone got to know each other. People would each stand up around the table, read out their question and answer it. And it was very emotional. Like, people that came as strangers really bonded and got to know each other. And I know 2 guys that came to one of our events, they were strangers and they now have a real estate business together, which is so cool. And I'm sure there's a million more stories like that. But I think the experiments that we can run and the tests and trying these new sort of formats of events outside of the online world is just as important as what we do online. And they have even really more valuable learnings, like sending a survey to someone online in our community and getting them to respond is some data, but getting real tangible and thoughts and feedback from people in person is so different to what they would write on a survey. And I think it's been like truly the best experience getting to do that. Like one just came to mind in Australia. Steve did meet and greets before the shows, and a man who I think is probably like 50 or 60 came to Steve and was bawling his eyes out. And he was like, "You actually saved my life." And I just thought, God, like all of us got really emotional because we're like, how does a podcast, somebody you just sit in a studio and record for a few hours, save someone's life? But it really does have that impact on people. And I think podcasting, not to go too back and forth with in-person events than podcasting, but podcasting in general has such a different connection with people now. And I was at the Dubai event. There was a guy called Jordan Matter, who's a massive YouTuber from the US. He has a family channel, 30-something million subscribers. And his daughter is kind of the main person in the channel. And her audience is connected with her more than they are probably connected with celebrities. And I think that's the most interesting part of podcasting or YouTube now in general is people are so much more dedicated to come and buy from you or are sold into your story. And what he said was, people know, if he asked people, he was like, if I asked you to name the color of a celebrity's bedroom, would you know? But you actually know your favorite YouTuber's bedroom color because you see and connect with them more. And I was like, it's such a fascinating world in general, how the industry is shifting from being connected or admiring celebrities to being more connected and admiring creators or podcasters. And that is a whole experiment in itself that I'm curious to deep dive into more and understand how the industry is shifting.
Yeah. This is maybe this is a strange question coming from me personally. Like anyone who knows me knows that this is not a topic that I enjoy discussing or think is worth discussing most of the time in experimentation, because we're talking about, like making some code changes to a website and it takes a couple minutes kind of deal. But in your role, especially as we're talking about experimenting with in-person events, these can be quite costly experiments to run, like not just in dollars, but it's a lot of time and attention and energy that a lot of members of the team need to put on like pulling one of these off. How do you think about prioritizing all these different experimentation efforts you could be doing and balancing, okay, we need to spend a little bit more time experimenting on the website or with the podcast format versus, we're going to go off and screen episodes in cinemas this year kind of deal? Like, I imagine that's a pretty tough challenge.
It is. And it's harder when you have 5 podcasts, not just one anymore. So it's where's your priorities? For us, it's what are our business KPIs? And I think this can relate to every business. What are the business KPIs and goals? And does every experiment you're doing help fuel one of those? Whether it is through a direct contribution to that number, if it's a financial number or a numerical value of a number of customers or viewers, but also the other side of it I see experimentation being really valuable in is knowledge gaining. In the sense of, for example, on the website, we can obviously experiment and know statistical significance, but on YouTube, we don't know how the algorithm works 100% of the time. And I don't think anyone ever will, as much as all these YouTube strategists say they do. Controversial. But I think the best part of experimenting on those platforms is if we can gain more knowledge to understand somehow or some parts of how the algorithm works, that is going to get us further. So it doesn't always, and I think that's how we prioritize. Well, there's a million ways we prioritize depending on our KPIs. But the first one is, does it still align with our company goals and KPIs? Then we go down to things like, for example, how do we get to live events? Is looking in, say, marketing and how do we experiment in marketing, looking at the funnel and going, how does it impact the goals and where should we experiment? So the reason we do live events is we really prioritize community, because those people at the bottom of the funnel that are a community that are going to be mega fans and buy things that you want to sell, or will be dedicated to write comments about you online, or maybe record a video saying how much they enjoy your content or business, they're the ones that you do need to put time into nurturing and experimenting with. And so even though the return on investment, we might only meet 100 people at an event or 1,000 people, whereas it could be 1 million online, I think there's very different value between the two. It's like the 1 million online are seeing you, fine. They're connecting with you online, but the connection in person is just a completely different level and creates brand advocacy rather than just brand awareness. And I think it goes even further to, if we're talking about just online in general, the different platforms and how do you experiment on those and bring in different audiences on those. Like short form platforms have a very, very different audience building to YouTube or a podcast where they're more connected and dedicated to you. So there's across the whole marketing or business and experiments in general, it really depends on what our goals are and how we want to achieve those and prioritize based on that.
One more piece of the pie that I want to make sure we cover in learning about your job, and that's the experiments you run internally, the experiments you run about how the company operates and what sorts of projects you all are focused on. And I want to ask a little specifically about AI, because when we chatted, what must have been last June in London, you were telling me about like kind of the AI hackathons going on and the experiments that different teams at FLIGHTSTORY were doing with AI. I think you were ahead of the curve in a lot of respects. Like here at Datadog, our like engineering leadership has really put out a mandate like, hey, the next 3-6 months, we need to be setting aside time to just experiment with AI coding tools for no reason other than to experiment, because clearly capabilities have increased a lot over the last 6 weeks alone as we're recording this, and we're not going to know where the capabilities, like where the boundaries are, until we get out and really try to push them. So I guess this is a 2-part question. One, can you tell us a little bit about like the internal spirit of experimentation at FLIGHTSTORY? And 2, can you share a little specifically about where you're experimenting with using AI internally?
Yeah. The hackathon was a really interesting time, because a lot of people, I think, when we talk about AI, people are like, oh, I've used ChatGPT. Yeah. But there's so much more to that. And last year, I think it was May, June when we ran the hackathon. And we have like a FlightX department, which is innovation and experimentation. So it's kind of like a task force that we're in of finding ways to build new tools or new things that can help speed up the business's growth. But the hackathon was across the whole business, and it was not a ChatGPT competition. It was, how can you build the best AI agent, AI tool, whatever you wanted to do in the AI landscape for 12 weeks. And it was fascinating to see people push themselves, but also people getting comfortable with AI. Like personally, I had used ChatGPT a little bit back then. I still was doing everything mainly manually because I still wanted to have the human side. Like when writing a LinkedIn post, I will never just use ChatGPT to write it. I will still write it myself. Even though some people think it's ChatGPT, which is hilarious. I'll take the compliment. But I hadn't really used it. And so I thought, okay, I'll give it a go. What can I do with this agent? And I tried, and it was really annoying. Like I kept getting, when I was building it, I was like, this keeps saying error or failing. But I was so addicted. Like every night, especially getting closer to the competition date, I could sit there for hours and I wouldn't even realize the time had gone by. It was that interesting. And I think it's not only for companies that want to be like AI futuristic. I think it's just really important to learn as humans of like, what can it do? What's out there? And I'm trying to teach my mum that as well, because she's in her 50s and she doesn't understand. She obviously knows ChatGPT, thank God. But she's still learning about all the things it can do. And I said, well, it could look in your calendar and tell you what you have on that day without you even having to look. It can text people if you need to as reminders for things. Like and they're the basics. That's just an automation, really. It's not even really the scope of what AI can do. But obviously that's still amazing to someone who's in their 50s. that it can do an automation. But I think for us, it was cool to see like how can we take what we're currently doing and almost in a nice way replace ourselves. And it's not so we're going to get fired or asked to leave. It's so if I can replace 100% of the work I'm doing or even 50% of the work, I then have that time to go and do other things. And that is the most valuable part. And now we're using it across the whole business. So, and I think the best part was people feel comfortable from testing in that hackathon to then go, actually, I will try and build that. It probably won't take me very long. And it's across every area. Like there's a guy, Matt, in our research team who research was obviously very non-AI, because I guess you can't trust everything ChatGPT says about someone. And so they were doing, our research team are incredible in general, that they're very manual. And he's been really interested in building AI tools around the analytics. And that's purely because we had the hackathon and he thought, actually, I'm really interested in this. I now feel comfortable doing it. And he's built some amazing dashboards and tools just from the experience of trying that, which has been really cool to see. And then in experiments in general is everything from how do we even track the experiments? Can we use AI to track them? To should they be like helping us come up with ideas? Because if it can be 10 times smarter than us, then 100%. And it doesn't, I think it's getting over the fear of going, oh, is it going to take my job? And being like, actually, if I embrace this, I'm going to be 10 times, even maybe 50 times better at my job. And so I can do so much more and achieve so much more. And that's been probably the best learning part of being able to use AI more in the business.
Yeah, I know the like late night AI coding addiction feeling well. That's where I am on the curve right now. I think the hip new term for it is Claude Code psychosis. So I'm very afflicted by Claude Code psychosis currently.
But I think it's cool because it's even easier, not that people should get into Claude Code psychosis, but it's easier for people to use AI and test things now. And it's like the basic things, like if you need and I don't think it should be used forever, but for example, like a landing page quickly designed in 5 minutes, AI can do it. I think you should still use developers for long-term things. And I think the flip side of that, what's really interesting is using some of the AI tools when a developer, and I'm not sure if you've experienced this, then goes to take it on. I know our developers have said this, there's usually a lot of unnecessary code within it. And so, yeah, vibe coding is good for now, but I am excited to see where it goes and how long can we keep doing it for and before something happens, but hopefully not.
Yeah. So maybe to put a nice bow on things, we can go back to the initial premise, which is like, what is Grace Miller's job, and like, what does it mean to spend time as a head of experimentation and failure at FLIGHTSTORY? We talked about like the parts of your job that look similar to other experimentation jobs. We talked about the parts that look very different than most other experimentation jobs, and the internal stuff. I guess just personally, like, is there a part of that that you most enjoy doing? Or maybe how do you split your time up in practice? Like, do you seem to spend more time on one of those areas than the other?
I think experimentation in general, I don't even think in a company like this, eventually my job should be redundant if everyone is experimenting themselves. Like, that is the goal. It should be, especially unless you're an experimentation company, it should be a cultural piece and an ethos within your team that people should want to experiment. So right now, my job split is a mix of helping the team run experiments. So whether that's educating them more on what is experimentation, how do we run it, or helping them come up with ideas and brainstorming experiments they could run. And then the flip side of that is also sometimes people need extra capacity and people to help run those experiments. So we come in almost like an extra team member for them, which is really nice. So we get to work across the whole business in that sense. Then there's things that I love every area of my job, but there's another part which is kind of like being on the forefront of what is possible And this is a mix between our innovation team, but also experimentation. And from an experimentation side, it's finding what is happening in the industry and how can we experiment on those new things. So one of the biggest one for us, that Steve mentioned at the World Economic Forum, was localization and AI translations of our content. And that came from experimentation and is still run within the experimentation team. But it's a really interesting dynamic of finding like what are the new things out there we can test and see that can then become a core part of the business. And that is a fascinating part to me. So whether it's going to conferences and talking to people and hearing about what they're doing and how we can implement experiments within ours, and getting inspiration, or being chronically online and seeing what's happening and understanding like the new features. And I love like what we said about before, Netflix sharing their experiments, but like YouTube, they share them all, which I love. And I'm like, we can see they're testing this new, like they took the dislike button off. And I was like, interesting. So what does that mean? And how does that mean for the future? Or Spotify and what they're experimenting with. So there's multiple parts, and like that staying ahead. Well, we call it staying ahead. We have a Slack channel where people can share new things happening in the industry. But the staying ahead part is a massive part of experimentation to make sure like we are always at the forefront of what's possible. Because if we were just doing day to day and continuing, well, not even if we weren't even experimenting in general, someone else would come up in the industry who's willing to experiment, try new things and test, and potentially become the biggest podcast. So it is, and I'm grateful Steve is such a big experimenter and innovator himself, because it makes our job so easy to get approvals and things on trying new things.
Yeah, you're so after, my own experimentation heart there on, you have to keep experimenting if you want to stay ahead of the curve. And also what you're putting your finger on there, like the necessary kind of growth curve in any company's experimentation journey is you as the head of experimentation go from someone who's running a bunch of experiments to just being this enabler and advocate and helping other people in the organization run as many tests as they can and whatever their areas of responsibility are. So that's perfect.
Yeah, I don't think you have to have an experimentation team. Like, it's a question I get asked a lot at whether it's company days or events, and they're like, but we don't have an experimentation department. And I don't think you need to. It's just an ethos and part of your culture to want to try new things that should be kind of ingrained.
So where can folks follow along with you as you keep going on this journey and keep pushing Flight Story into the experimentation stratosphere?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn under Grace Miller, and then I'm also sharing now on Instagram under Grace Experiments, where I try and share as much as I can about my job, but also what's happening in the industry and how people are experimenting, which is quite cool. And then also do lots of podcasts and talks that I try and share on there as well.
I love it. Fantastic. We need more experimentation content on Instagram. Not that I scroll the feed too often, but I like that someone's doing it. Grace, thank you so much.
No, thank you for having me.
Thanks again to Grace so much for joining us and for walking us through all the incredibly interesting parts of her role. Hopefully you took some inspiration from that, places where you could experiment, even if it's not A/B tests, that's still very much in the spirit of tinkering, learning, and applying what works elsewhere. For more experimentation content, keep it locked here to the Datadog Community YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm Ryan Lucht. Keep experimenting.